When I was asked to participate in this event, the topic I was given was the national question. And I began wondering how I would approach it in the light of your discussion around transformation. Because there isn't an immediate and obvious relationship between these issues. And one can speak at great length about the national question without making the connections between what you're trying to do at this university, indeed at various universities in this country at this time. So I'll provide you a brief synoptic view of what the national question is about, and then attempt to relate it to the question of transformation at this and other institutions. The national question, by the way, there is now, for all of you who are interested, it just so happens that a book has been published titled The Unresolved National Question. It's published this year. It's Wits University Press, edited by Webster. And it provides you a much more detailed account than I am able to do in the time I have here. But essentially, in the struggles against apartheid, the liberation movements, the wide diversity of the liberation movement, was obliged to enter into a discussion, a debate, a contentious debate, I must tell you, because there were really divergent views within the liberation movement about what has come to be known as the national question. It's a question of how exactly we can build a nation, and in fact how we can struggle for the achievement of a particular nationhood in the post-apartheid period. The debate, of course, its provenance lay in a discussion about the suggestion that what would resolve the national question here was the idea of a native republic. This was in the 1920s and 30s. A debate arose about that precise question, stimulated, I dare say, by our relationship then, or the relationship between the Communist Party of South Africa and the Soviet Communist Party. But the debate took a much larger turn and encompassed a much wider variety of issues as time progressed, and particularly from about the 1960s, given the more complex arrangement of political organizations in the liberation movement, the debate began to express the perspectives of Africanists. And by the way, there were divisions, within Africanism, within those who pursued an Africanist perspective to the national question, liberals, even there were divisions, Marxists, and of course Africanists. So, and there is huge literature on this question. And clearly, all of them were drawing on a variety and range of historical backgrounds. As you know, at the turn of the 20th century, there was a very strong debate amongst European socialists about the idea of self-determination of nations. And it was this, too, which formed the background. But I suppose it achieved new urgency with the onset of the struggles against colonialism. So there is a very wide canvas of discussions about what the national question is all about. And this is what came to South Africa. The issues which the national question raised, a very wide range of issues, In the first instance, they talked about how nations are constituted, or what constitutes a nation. And there were debates about the relationship between nationhood and language, territorial integrity, economic systems, etc., etc. There were debates about the political economy of colonial states. In other words, how exactly countries like South Africa evolved, what the political economy of the evolution of South African capitalism from the 19th century premised on the forms of accumulation based on the destruction of the rights of indigenous people, the colonization of the communities of South Africa and the process of land dispossession, and of course the conversion of the population of this country and countries throughout into cheap labor. So there were huge debates about how to understand the concept of nationhood against a background informed by a particular approach to the political economy of apartheid and of apartheid capitalism. Remember that apartheid, although it is was the form of state post-1948, it was in fact the culmination of the earlier segregationist policies which in fact shaped the historical conjuncture which arrived at this really conflictual, contradictory and contentious system of apartheid. The issue which also preoccupied these debates was the question of race and racism. What exactly was the place of race and racial description, the categorization of people into races? How should we understand that? Should we, in fact, accept that races exist in human societies, or are these, in fact, characterizations of phenotypical and external appearances? What exactly is the relationship between ideas of the concept, the biological concept of race and the idea of subjugation by the use of color and phenotypical characteristics, racism? What and how exactly should these things be understood and interpreted? And in the same way, what exactly was intended by the variety of uses of terms like ethnicity, nation, group, etc.? Because these terms were prolific in the writings of the variety of approaches to the question of nationhood or to the national question. And there were some pungent criticisms, actually, of some of the usages which characterize the literature. The national question also raised the debates around whether the South African Revolution was a continuous revolution for democratic and social and economic rights, or whether it could only be achieved in stages. And this echoed the much larger discussion, global discussion around whether revolutions are permanent or staged. And of course, inevitably, the debate also raised the question of agency. Who exactly, what social class, what composition of the population of South Africa, described racially or otherwise, should provide the leadership for the onslaught against the apartheid state and for a post-apartheid future? This too was an extremely difficult and somewhat tendentious argument, because it depended on your political persuasion, what particular view you pursued in all of this. So the question of agency was hugely implicated in the strategic approaches various organizations in the liberation movement adopted towards the national question. Well, being in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, the issues about gender and environment were hardly touched upon, and it's not surprising. But I think we now, living somewhat in a more informed time, must acknowledge that these debates, in which some of us were involved, were limited in some ways, although they were really expansive and they dealt with 1,000 things. But there were some very important things, gender questions, for instance, which were always sublimated to questions of national struggle, not only in South Africa, but universally. These debates are in the feminist literature too. This question of whether the issue of the rights of women and the place of gender in social change is sublimated to some other struggle. I think we've come to the acceptance that these are coterminous. This separation is really not productive. And the environmental questions, as we all know, even now have not been sufficiently surfaced. Yet, I must say that these discussions that took place in the liberation movement, and which sometimes affected some aspects of academic life, not much, were extremely important. They were important because essentially they were a metaphor for the question, what kind of society do we want to build in the struggles against apartheid? What exactly would be the nature of the social forms of organization which will get us past an oppressive and exploitative regime? How exactly are we to reconcile with each other in ways which do not reproduce new forms of oppression and exploitation? So it's a metaphor, it's an absolutely fundamental set of discussions about what kind of society we want to achieve. And I want to say, by reference to this conference, and I have been participant in other discussions at other universities on this very question, that the vast majority of academics are not dealing with these unresolved questions in any systematic and organized, either theoretical or practical way. There is a huge silence, with the exception of a few scholars in academia who deal with things based on their disciplinary boundaries and their subjective interests. There is not in the community of the universities a robust, fulsome discussion, expansive discussion about the issues which characterize the debates in the liberation movement around how we are to construct a post-apartheid nationhood. In other words, we have not properly, outside the framework of some limited discussion about rainbow nations and some critique of that, we have not discussed the question of South African nationhood and how it might be constituted, or how such an approach, what approach we might use to advance the concept, in my view, of the idea of a common humanity, a humanity which is not at war with itself or with its physical environment. I think we are nowhere near discussing that issue. And contemporary analyses are stuck very often, except for some exceptions, in discussions about power, narrowly conceived, about personality, politics, race, and policies. And I think that's just not expansive enough. I think very little of it deals with the wider realms of political economy, the grip of neoliberal ideas, the commodification of knowledge. Very little of it talks about the continuities of racialized identities, as though these are essential identities in building a nation. Very little of it talks about the cultural and linguistic representations post-apartheid. There is only a very selected discussion on the commodification of knowledge. And in fact, what we have in the sciences too is a continued insistence on narrow scientific and determinist views about the role of science and education. I think that there is no coherent theorization nor any examination of the questions which require us to produce the intellectual agencies, the public intellectualism, which will support the process of defining how a nation is constituted. And this, despite the wider implications of roads must fall and fees must fall, despite the implications of those discussions, and very importantly, issues around curriculum and so on, despite that, our main emphasis continues to be a discussion about the hierarchies in institutions and anti-democratic practices in the institutional structures, racism and gender in institutional cultures, demographic distributional issues, HR, wages, differentiation around those things. Yes, very importantly, about issues of syllabus, pedagogical issues and strategies, and teaching and learning questions in general. I'm not saying that those are unimportant. On a day-to-day basis, those things are absolutely central to any discussion about the life of an educational institution. But institutions in society are simply trapped if they are unable to reconcile their role to a broader vision of society. You know, there was an old debate between Jake Schervel and Neville Alexander about 30 years ago, conducted in a little journal called the Afrikaan. Schervel pronounced that the UWC would be a university of the left. And Alexander's counter was that, well, you cannot do that. Not in a society which is struck by the power of apartheid. Unless you begin changing apartheid itself, the idea of a university of the left was fraught with difficulties and unachievable. I think we're in exactly the same situation. How can we talk about issues of transformation outside the framework of a broader discussion and providing from these institutions the impetus for more fundamental rethinking? What are some of the critical issues which, for me, constitute such fundamental rethinking? Firstly, I think we have to stimulate much wider public debate about a vision and a set of social, humanitarian, and ecologically informed values, relationships, and being, together with the structural forms of organization that will give expression to that. In other words, your struggles, our struggles, institutional struggles, are simply, in my view, inseparable from a discussion of what kind of values we should promote in society and provide the platforms for a much more robust discussion on all of that. We should think much more determinedly about the corpus, the body of our intellectual work, about our research and teaching in relation to these wider issues, not in relation to the kinds of narrow, even if global scholarship, which is accredited in our journals. I'm not against that, but I think they have limitations. I think that, in fact, that kind of scholarship simply pursues the agenda of one's own academic advancement. But it does not engage with the much more intractable and difficult questions which face society. We have to start thinking much more about the location of universities in societies, in the communities in which they are. This whole pursuit really is really unconscionable from my point of view. This pursuit of rankings and so on and so forth is really a distraction. It's a distraction from what we should be thinking about, and it forces us into a mode of thinking which is competitive and false. Because quite honestly, there are no objective criteria for trying to compare Harvard even with Oxford, for the simple reason that the endowments that those two institutions have available to them are considerably different, leave alone comparing Oxford and Harvard to the Sewanee University of Technology. You know, these are really very fatally flawed comparisons. I think you yourselves must develop what you regard as measures for your own achievements, for what you think is possible within the realm of your own work. But to force yourself to submit to the kind of criteria which have very little relevance. And now, fortunately, there is a literature which is emerging, which provides a critique for that kind of false promise. We have to think about the implications of how knowledge is not constructed in these institutions alone. That there are communities out there which have not only been ignored by our segregationist and apartheid past, but which continue to be ignored by us. We talk about this idea of community engagement. Well, it's completely superficial. The idea of the co-construction of knowledge is a fundamentally different idea to that which we presently practice by activities such as, classes on Saturdays and so on and so forth. I'm not against that, please. Don't misunderstand me. But I think that the charge on all of us at the moment at institutions like this is to understand the store of historical knowledge, understanding, and experiential learning which communities which are beset with the most difficult problems in our society are daily experiencing, and what their understanding of it is. A few years ago, I was associated in a research project which tried to understand the phenomenon of education in rural communities. And having myself worked as a policy maker, policy bureaucrat, I realized how little we really understood the nature of our communities. and how little we understood the kinds of knowledge which reside in our communities, which we had to engage with, to co-construct the kinds of solutions, the potential for resolving some of the most difficult questions in the educational system. I'm afraid our public policy simply continues to ignore this very important imperative. So the idea of the co-construction of knowledge between institutions of learning and research and the communities in which we are embedded is simply non-existent at the moment, because we do not know how to engage with those communities. We do not know how to do that mutually, respectfully, except, for the purposes of gathering data, which I think really is hardly the means of producing real knowledge. The point I want to make about curriculum issues and the knowledge question, because we are also in danger of becoming chauvinistic, insular, and linear. I've just come from a conference which we held last week on a memorial to the life of Neville Alexander. Alexander produced 33 pieces of writing which were published in serial form, 33 weeks in the Learning Post. Very few of you know about that. It was in 1980, in which he serialized for the nation, because it was read by 750,000 people weekly, the history of this continent, starting with the origins of Homo sapiens on this continent, identifying a number of very important civilizations which thrived for several thousands of years prior to colonization. Discuss issues of language and identity within the context of the evolution of communities. Now, was he doing that to romanticize our history or to present it as being linear? No. Alexander was an unremitting Marxist. And for him, contradiction lies at the in the depth of all societies. And a part of our function in academia is to understand the forms of social organization as they evolve in all their contradictoriness, and not to pretend that cultures are immutable, that languages have no change, that traditions are always positive. In fact, our role is to reinstate our historical knowledge systems and cultures critically. We don't need to be defensive about, because the only basis on which societies progress is by a critical consciousness. And that's what we have to teach younger people in our academies. Not submission to some new dogma, because that would be as dangerous as what apartheid and colonialism has done. So the idea of a critical literacy and critical thinking is absolutely central to what we have to do. And as part of that, we have to recognize that the origins of knowledge lie in this continent. Hypothetical-deductive thinking comes from, by some research, from earliest forms of long-term speculative hunting carried out by the Ikung, Islam, and various communities in southern Africa. So the idea that scientific knowledge, is post-Renaissance knowledge is really risible. Science, its origins lie in Homo sapiens about 100,000 years ago, at least. So I can see that my time is about to be up. And if you'll permit me, I have 5 minutes? Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, that's generous. Thank you very much. So knowledge has been accumulating in human societies for tens of thousands of years. Great civilizations have been built in those tens of thousands of years. Great centers of learning have existed in the past, long before Bologna, which is a relatively recent development in the 13th century. I know Rasigan and I have been collecting a record of historical institutions of learning, from starting with China in the extreme east, right up to the Mayans. There have been any number of huge developments of knowledge systems, throughout these countries. And of course, we know that our own civilizations in this continent, there must have been at least 50 major civilizations in this continent. In this part of the world, the 9Motala is well known, the Great Zimbabwe is well known. But there are civilizations all over Africa. In Axum, sorry, my memory, I can't just roll them off my tongue. But if you look at Alexander's book, you will find examples of these, in which there were fairly advanced systems of knowledge developing. And so the idea that we have to decenter European epistemologies is a very, very important one, is an extremely important one. I would say it's quite fundamental to restore the origins of knowledge to humanity in general and to this continent in particular. It's extremely important, but we dare not become chauvinistic and parochial. We must, because we have to share these knowledges much more widely, And I want to say, for instance, there's a recent artifact found at the University of Columbia. It's called Plimpton 322, which shows that trigonometric tables were first understood in early Babylonia, 3,500 years ago. 1,000 years before Hipparchus is said to have started trigonometry, the Babylonians, 1,000 years before, knew Pythagoras' theorem and knew and had a formula for the effect of what I'm saying. To conclude, is that we have to reconcile the exogenous, larger, societal, human questions with our search for endogenous structures by reconstituting them in ways which speak to a wider humanity. If we do not do that, we will be discussing these issues even the next time we meet in 50 years' time. Thank you.